Hello, this is Jim Schwab, manager of the American Planning Association's Hazards Planning Research Center and the project manager for Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation, a project funded by FEMA under which we're presenting the Recovery News blog. And with me today is Ed Thomas. Ed is the president of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association. He's an elected member of the Council of the State and Local Government Section of the American Bar Association and chair of the Hazard Subcommittee of the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee of the American Bar Association, and also serves on the advisory committee of the Natural Hazard Center out at the University of Colorado, which runs an excellent conference every year in July, bringing about 400 or 500 experts from various disciplines and disasters together to have discussions about the future of hazards policy in this country. And Ed's also an active member of APA, we're proud to say, and also the American Geophysical Union. So Ed's got a long list of other credits, but we're here to talk about Sandy and the impact of Sandy on the Northeast and what its implications are for long-term community recovery planning and hazard mitigation in the states that are affected. So let me start, Ed, by bringing up the great bugaboo about climate change and weather uncertainty, since we seem to be entering a period of greater weather uncertainty ushered in by climate change and global warming. How does this affect our ability to anticipate events like Hurricane Sandy, and what does it do to our modeling of floods and storms that we've traditionally based on historical patterns?
Well, the second federal insurance administrator once described what we do with community development as driving an 18-wheel, huge rig truck, 80 miles an hour down the highway, steering by looking in the rearview mirrors only. We need to look not just in the rearview mirrors. We need to look out in the front in the windshield and think about the future. And I think that's the essence of planning. Where are we going and how can we get there and stay, between the white lines on the road as we drive along and really do a little bit of visioning. And generally we're not doing that. The reality is most local governments, state governments, and the federal government have not done a very good job planning and preparing for historic floods and natural events, just that are totally foreseeable by history. Now, the future is even more uncertain than it was before, and we need to take that into account. And there are steps that can be taken where we can still have development. I am certainly not suggesting no to development. Demographic pressures will inevitably drive development. We're going to have more development. The question is whether we'll continue to have development that harms people, the environment, and the taxpayer, or whether we're going to have good, sound, well-planned development.
Could you elaborate on what some of those steps might be that you just referred to?
Well, the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association has on its website a paper that lays out steps that can be considered for future planning. And basically what we're suggesting is look at the reality of the situation and deal with it. And we can do this in a very orderly, well-planned process, or we can do it simply reacting to what is in the short-term economic best interest of an individual homeowner or developer. So we need to look first at what are the existing rules, and then think about, from a planning perspective, from a planner's perspective, are these rules really good enough? For example, many communities in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland have new flood insurance rate maps in the process of being developed. Those maps have a lot of good information in them, and yet they're absolute minimum standards. So we should start by saying, look, hey, maybe my existing rules allow me to build at a level below the experienced height of the Sandy storm. Or maybe they would just have me build at that height. Let's look at the new documents from FEMA, and let's think about doing things maybe a little bit more safely with freeboard. Let's think about those buildings down in Lower Manhattan dozens and dozens of buildings, according to the New York Times yesterday, where there was water went into the basement, and those buildings will be knocked out of action for months and months, millions of dollars in economic losses, and yet those buildings could have been structurally flood-proofed with wet or dry flood-proofing techniques so that they would be open for business today or tomorrow. And so we have a variety of steps that we can take on an individual homeowner, individual community basis, and also regionally to look forward to doing things better. Elevation, floodproofing, seriously considering is a development in a particular location, is it really in the right, best location from the point of view of that homeowner? Or should it possibly be moved inland? Government coming up with techniques to say, look, if you don't want to come back into this same area, we can come up with techniques such as transferable development rights or other low-cost techniques, or the entire vast cornucopia of programs that are made available after a disaster to give people and communities the ability to really think about the future.
Okay, I have a couple other questions here, but let me follow up just a little further on that. One of the other things that was clearly a big issue in the Northeast, particularly in New York City and Lower Manhattan, had to do with the ability to protect infrastructure, to mitigate against damage to infrastructure, including obviously the power system, which is pretty drastically affected in this case. What would you suggest on that front?
Well, I think can we deal first with the subways? We talk
Sure.
about infrastructure.
Sure.
Subways, by their very nature, can be flood-proofed. You can for lower cost, you can keep your vents with some elevation. There are techniques on this. When you consider the tiny cost of this type of retrofitting versus the vast expense that is now being incurred, it just really makes sense to do this differently and better. And as we are fixing those subway stations and those tunnels, to seriously think about, okay, well, we know what the Sandy flood height was, and we know for a fact, an absolute fact based on history, based on a repetition of historic storms, that Sandy isn't the worst possible storm to hit New York City, just based on history. And then think, well, how about the future? We know sea level rise is an accepted fact. Now, there are people that get very hinky about the words climate change used together, and they say that it's not proven or that it's a left-wing conspiracy. But there are certainly tremendous uncertainties as to flood elevations. So let's add some extra flood-proofing onto the existing minimum requirements and flood-proof those subway stations. For power lines, let's think about, okay, I own a building. It's in Manhattan, and it absolutely has to have power in order to run the elevators, in order to run the lights and the computers, for me to be open for business. How can I accept the fact that possibly the power system will fail and have backup power for minimum operations? From a community perspective, so many of the power lines came down because we had objects slamming into them, or more likely, we had trees coming down on them. We need to have more trees to reduce our global warming, but it's got to be the right tree, properly trimmed on the utility rights of way. There's a lot that we can do prior to a storm, years and years prior to a storm, in order to accept the idea that inevitably we will have storms, windstorms, snowstorms, hurricanes, and how can we deal with the reality to prevent the damage if possible, and then how to be resilient and operational for the future when inevitably we have these damages.
Okay. Well, I have to point out that you live in Boston, which puts you up in the general target area, but somewhat at the outer edge of the impacts of Sandy. Not necessarily at the heart of the event like Manhattan or New Jersey, but it does at least mean that you're living every day with what's up there in New England. What do you think are some of the unique vulnerabilities of this very dense cluster of urban centers that we've got in the Northeast that really were the bullseye for this particular storm.
Well, let me start out by saying I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in New York City. I grew up in New York City. Spent the first 21 years of my life there. Went to school in New York City, Cardinal Hayes High School and Fordham University. So I very much still consider myself a New Yorker, and my heart goes out to those folks. The biggest problem we have, I believe, in New York, the Jersey Shore, and so many other places is we've had this tremendous blessing of life without major storms for years and years. It has been many years since a really major hurricane slammed into New York City, slammed into Long Island, slammed into New England. We've had minor hurricanes. We've had Hurricane Gloria in 1986 in New England. We've had Hurricane Bob in 1991. But they were very small hurricanes compared to actual historic hurricanes, such as the hurricane that hit New York City in 1821, or the what's called the Long Island Express, or in New England, the wind that shook the world of 1938. So we've had generations of developers, generations of homeowners who somehow got it into their heads that they just weren't very flood prone or very prone to storms. So that lack of awareness is perhaps our biggest obstacle of all, getting people to recognize that inevitably there would be flooding. It was well known in the emergency management community that Lower Manhattan was seriously prone to flooding in a repetition of a major historic hurricane. Just an historic hurricane, never mind the future with climate change, never mind the significant rise in sea levels since the last time a hurricane hit New York, a major hurricane hit New York Harbor in 1821. Keeping that all together, we have generations of people who are totally stunned and totally taken aback by the reality of them having to deal with natural hazards.
Well, as a former New Yorker, you will appreciate that they probably should have also talked to my father, who grew up in Queens and remembered distinctly the Long Island Express of 1938. And I remember being told some interesting stories about that.
I bet. Yeah, we'll have to talk about that sometime. Yeah, my family, of course, were there in 1938, and they talked about that. And my granddad talked about the blizzard of 1888 and the tremendous impact that had on the city. So we need to remember our elders telling us about the reality of these storms. It's very difficult to get people to pay attention to an event that is rare. David Ropeek has an excellent book on that, journalist and instructor at Harvard's Extension University, or PEIK, talking about why people have a real hard time thinking about rarely repetitious hazards. And certainly New York, New England, gosh, we haven't been really slammed in years and years, and yet we have in the past. There's no question that we will in the future. And getting people to do those preparations for a rare event is a tremendous challenge, and one that I'm hoping, Jim, that we talk about quite a bit at the International Hazard Mitigation Practitioners Symposium that's going to be in July, just following the Natural Hazards Conference that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Before I get to my next question, let me just comment on that. Because on Friday, I'm going to be talking about this experience, as a matter of fact, at a conference on global health and disasters out at the University of Iowa School of Public Health. I was in Sri Lanka as part of the post-tsunami assessment back in 2005, and people there were telling our team that they had no historical record of a previous tsunami in Sri Lanka. Trying to say, basically, well, we had no way to expect something like this. It did not take me very long checking the historical records to find that, in fact, they had a tsunami from Krakatoa in 1884 or whatever year that was, but nobody remembered it.
Right. Sure.
So that's you're right about that. I mean, people's memory gets short.
Yeah, memory is very short, and people, according to psychologists, have a tendency to remember the good things. They have a hard time remembering the really, really bad things. It's what we're trying to do. I believe you and I are to introduce the planning community and the community development folks to the reality of getting ready for a balanced approach to a rare but definitely foreseeable event. There's no question we're going to have these events, and a very small amount of preparation, a very small amount of elevation, floodproofing, or thought can save millions and millions of dollars, save lives, reduce economic suffering, and reduce environmental desolation. And getting the attention of people to do that is very difficult. And that's to some extent why we have zoning and building codes to think about that ahead of time. Fold those considerations right into your comprehensive plan, and then stick with it for possibly 50 years, 60 years, 100 years until we really get slammed again. And that's going to be difficult to do. One of the neat things that's coming out of this storm, though, is all of a sudden the discussion of climate change has become respectable. I do lecturing all over the country, as you know, Jim, and I go up into Iowa and Colorado and Montana, and the local sponsors will often tell me, Ed, you can use the word climate and you can use the word change, but please don't use them in the same paragraph. It's people, many people out there have gotten the idea that the climate change is a left-wing conspiracy. It has to do with funding Obamacare. Seriously. That's their belief, and that's fine. What we have to do is get across to people is, even if you don't believe in climate change, understand that prognostications about the future are uncertain. And when we say that something is a 1% annual chance flood, that doesn't mean that it is going to be absolutely correct. There's a variability there, and for a very small amount of money, you can get a lot of protection, particularly when you build, design, and rebuild a building. I mean, I'm hoping our planners, our planning community in New York City says, look, this is absolutely insane that we have buildings, multi-million-dollar buildings, important businesses put out of business because of very small relative amount of money that could have been spent floodproofing, wet or dry those buildings, wet floodproofing or dry floodproofing. I mean, and that we as planning, as part of the planning community, take the lead in saying, we've got to do this differently, we've got to do this better, we've got to turn around and do community development very differently than we have before by looking down the road and keeping the trucks between the white lines, thinking about things ahead of time.
Great. Well, let me ask you this question as the current president of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association, which, by the way, if you would like to tell us a little bit about that, you may, but you're also an active land use attorney, longtime consultant in this whole field. Are there particular resources that you would like to recommend to planners in these communities affected by Sandy that you think would make their job easier?
Absolutely. To go to the Jim Schwab website at APA for the Hazards Planning Research Center, for starters. If you're a planner, there's a lot of material on there that needs to be looked at. As a planner, to understand all the resources that are available post-Sandy. The only document that I know that describes that is the NHMA publication, which is available online at the NHMA website, called Patchwork Quilt. Planning, building stuff differently and better. We need to talk about change as planners. And fundamentally, particularly in post-disaster situations, people resist change. Jim's described what I am and what I do. I was also a federal coordinating officer for FEMA. That was the president's representative on scene. I have literally dealt and worked something like 200 disasters. I stopped counting. It's something around 200. I have worked one-on-one with hundreds and hundreds of disaster victims and survivors. And I've seen their misery. I've seen their suffering. It is an important part of my life. And what we as planners need to think of is that this is not dry, dusty plans. This is about people's lives. This is about life safety. This is about core environmental and economic business values. that if we do a good job on planning, Mother Nature will do what she does, which she's going to do anyway. And then there will either be devastation in the community, or we will have a well-engineered, well-architecturally designed, well-planned community that takes the hit but just keeps on working. And right now, we're seeing very few communities that have done that. There are some. There are some wonderful bright lights around the country. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the metropolitan Denver area, due to the efforts of the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. And we need to have a lot more bright, shining lights. And I hope that the planning community will produce those bright, shining lights and examples all over the eastern seaboard following Sandy.
Great. Any final comments you want to throw in here?
Well, I think the Natural Hazard Mitigation website also has excellent resources. We're in the process of setting up a Sandy resource area that's going to have things like our steps to recovery for a safe future, and we'll have many other items in there. And so I'm hoping to work very closely with you, Jim, and to encourage planners to talk together, to work with their neighbors, possibly through the Resilient Neighbors Network program that FEMA has funded, working with the APA. We can do a very different future. We can vision a very different future and execute that vision, or we can go back to business as usual and be talking about some other hurricane someday that has done devastation. Possibly, quite possibly, not in Jim Schwab or Ed Thomas's lifetime, but down the road. Possibly this week, right? We're talking about a nor'easter slamming into the New York, New Jersey area. A lot of flap on that, or possibly, God forbid, in Boston Harbor as well, which is a real concern to me because I live in the special flood hazard area of Boston Harbor.
Doesn't the Northeaster know that that's called piling on in the NFL?
Mother Nature doesn't read the NFL rule book, I'm afraid, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jim.
Appreciated having you.